this is our last segment. Well done, you made it. And I know this is a lot to take in again. So we are wrong button there. There we go. Okay. So now in our last segment, we're going to talk about thinking about offenders and certainly response issues. So we're going to walk through some ideas about offender tactics. We are going to walk through some general things, but in a specific scenario that we use to talk about grooming directed at children. How do we think about recognizing concerning behavior related to that? But we will try to go beyond that in terms of some of the information and takeaways we have for tactics that go beyond just child offenders, because of course, those are things we have to account for in the church, is not simply child offenders, but others as well. And then we'll talk about reporting issues, a few things related to policy in a more detail than we've mentioned so far. But because of some of the constraints on our schedule today, and you know, you just can't say everything on these issues that are complex. I'm going to have some things in the slides that you'll be able to reference that we won't have time to go through in detail today, but that are important in regard to policy. Okay, and as I said, we will carve out time at the end, certainly for more reflection and, oop, yep. If we can mute, if you're not on mute, please. Thanks. Okay. And then we will carve out time for some processing together as a group, and certainly any questions we'll try to help with. Although certainly there's so many hard questions in this area, and certainly I do not view you know, our organization as the ones with all the answers. Certainly we have learned a lot over the years. Okay. So when we think about offenders, it shouldn't come as any surprise at this stage in our training today that Dr. Anna Salter would say something like this: most offenders will deliberately establish themselves as the kind of person who wouldn't do that kind of thing. And this, to me, is very much the sentiment that Jesus was getting at when he talked about a wolf in sheep's clothing, that double life, that intentional cultivation of a perception within the church community. The cases of abuse of power we have seen over and over again, and whether it's a clergy sexual abuse offender who's offended against adults, child offenders, or whether it's intimate partner violence happening at home behind closed doors, and then there is a perception of that person or family on Sunday morning that everyone thinks, of course, they're a wonderful Christian family. We would never think anything like that was happening behind closed doors. And other forms of abuse of power as well. You can make the same sort of distinction or idea related to how someone in that deliberate tactic is cultivating a certain perception of themselves, that they would never do that kind of thing. Without going into detail, for those of you who are interested in connecting the Bible directly to issues of abuse or offenders in particular, there is a psalm where the whole topic of the psalm, Psalm 10, is about those who are predatory in a very calculated and callous way. And throughout that psalm, there's a major theme that this is a person acting with pride and arrogance and entitlement. And a second major theme is that the person is saying, no one will stop me, no one will hold me accountable. And the psalm actually closes with prayers for accountability. And that's a real focus and theme of the psalm, is that is what's needed. There needs to be accountability for those who prey upon others, for those who abuse power. And that is actually something that's critical for leaders to grasp. We do not lead with grace and forgiveness when someone is caught abusing power. or we believe someone has abused power, but we take a different posture. All right. We didn't have time to go through that in detail, but I did want to mention it. Now, we're going to talk about grooming tactics and one other major grouping of tactics called DARVO here in a moment. But grooming is a word probably most of us have heard, if not all of us. So when we use grooming with regard to child offenders, here is a more detailed definition from Jim Clemente, who worked at the FBI for many years, and some of that time specifically on child sexual abuse. He's actually a survivor, has talked about his story publicly of child sexual abuse. And he says, look, the grooming process is typically aimed at the intended child victims and those who are responsible for their well-being, as well as the community that they operate in. So let's just stop for a second. Notice what he said. It's not just directed at the victim. So we've said this before, and again, that's what Jesus was getting at, that it's directed, this double life, this calculated deception and manipulation is not just directed at a targeted victim, but at parents and caregivers, and certainly at the whole community in which they operate. And this is certainly true of many cases of abuse in a church setting. This is the dynamic at work. He goes on to say, grooming is a constellation of otherwise innocent appearing behavior that is intended to give them ongoing access to children for sexual purposes, as well as preventing discovery by others. So notice he uses the word constellation of otherwise innocent appearing behavior. Let's break that down for just a moment. It's not just one thing. It's a variety of tactics. It's a variety, it's a multitude of behaviors. And many times it is just what he says here, innocent appearing behavior. If you Google any list of grooming behaviors, things like giving gifts and spending time with kids and things of that nature, a lot of those lists you can say, well, yeah, okay, I can see how that could be used by someone to manipulate and gain access to kids. But also that just sounds like grandma who loves kids and is not a predator. And that's what Jim Clemente is getting at here. The distinguishing feature of grooming behavior is not the behavior itself. It's why the behavior is being used. Offenders use it as a very deliberate, calculated tactic to gain access, to test for weaknesses, to look for opportunities, and to keep people silent once the offending has begun. And so that's really what is going on very often. And so the distinguishing key feature of grooming and recognizing it is not the behavior itself often, but it's how it's being used. And that's very difficult because it is very difficult in one moment in time with one example of a certain behavior to know what someone's intentions are and to put it in a broader context or a pattern. And that's why concerning behavior must be documented, and we must develop a culture that if someone is concerned about safety in any regard, or if there's a policy violation, that we document it. With that practice, we are more easily able to recognize someone who is testing for weaknesses, testing for vulnerabilities, looking for opportunities. Someone who is not respectful of the boundaries we've set in our community or personal boundaries that have been set by an individual or a family. And to me, that is a helpful shorthand, easy way to think about grooming. Grooming is testing. It's testing boundaries for vulnerabilities, testing for opportunities, testing for information that can be used. And it's often progressive. Touch is progressive. It starts with innocent touch, a high five, a pat on the back, and it goes further to test. How does the person react? How do they respond? How do their parents respond when I do this in front of them? How do other people respond when I do this in the youth group meeting or outside of it in the foyer or wherever we are gathered as a community? progressively taking touch further, developing trust, and developing and testing for an opportunity for further isolation often is another common tactic. So grooming is testing. And that means there, again, there are not simply a list of behaviors that these are grooming and these are not. That's not how it works. The tactics are malleable, they're flexible, they're contextual to the situation. So we have to go deeper if we're going to get better at recognizing concerning behavior. And very often the question then is raised, well, does that mean we just need to treat everybody with suspicion and we just need to be paranoid at church all the time? And the answer to that is an emphatic no. So there is a very clear difference to us from a mentality of paranoia and a mentality that is properly vigilant. And I'll just give you a story as an example. I'll never forget a pastor reached out to me at some point and said, Mike, can I talk to you about something? I'm concerned. I said, yes, of course. What's going on? He said, after I give my sermon, I go in front of the pulpit, I give a blessing, a benediction, and I dismiss the congregation. Some young kids in the church have started running up to me after the service and giving me hugs. And I'm concerned about that. And I said, okay, why are you concerned? And he said, well, you know. And I said, no, I don't know. I'm not concerned about that at all. Why am I not concerned? Because the kids were initiating the contact. They welcomed it. It was also fully transparent to other adults. So I'm not concerned about it in the slightest. Paranoia says, don't touch kids, don't talk to kids, don't hug kids ever. That's not helpful. That's paranoia. Now, I told the pastor, look, if you were going up to kids to give them hugs and they didn't want the hugs, then I would be concerned. If you kept hugging them when they didn't want to be hugged, I would be very concerned that you are not respecting those boundaries. And if you were taking kids to your office away from everyone else so that the touch in that power differential was not accountable, then I would be concerned. But I'm not concerned about what you described. So paranoia says, don't touch kids, don't talk to kids, don't hug kids ever. That's not healthy or helpful. Children need healthy touch that they welcome within boundaries to have healthy development. It's good to have that physical affection within those boundaries. So that's the difference. Do you see the difference between paranoia and a proper vigilance? Within clear boundaries, of course, we don't have to be suspicious all the time because we've agreed to the boundaries. We're taking abuse seriously. We've named what abuse is. We have policies. And within those policies and boundaries, we are establishing a track record of trust with everyone in the community, such that when someone is testing boundaries or disregarding them or violating our policy, that should stand out all the more. That's what we need to be, so that's the difference to me. All right, now we do want to teach some of these grooming tactics to our congregations. And so we're going to walk through a scenario now where we practice this. And this is something we would do with a congregation as well. So I'm going to read through a story. It's not an actual story, but the mother in this story successfully protects her kid from the abuse. This is a composite story from some stories that we know of. And some of the techniques we know are used at times by certain types of offenders. So this is about an offender who focuses on younger children. So we're going to walk through, and I just want to give a couple of caveats before we dive in. I'm going to read this story to you and you're going to listen carefully, and I'm going to ask you some questions, and you're going to do very well at noticing some things that are very concerning. And you're going to do so well at this. I just want to say, we need to be very careful in thinking that this type of a story fully prepares us to recognize concerning behavior or grooming behavior. The reason is, where are we right now, for one? we're in a training on abuse prevention. So of course, we're all thinking of this right now. That's not how real life works though. We're not typically thinking of this every moment, and that's not really healthy. Second of all, I'm going to read this whole story at once, and you're going to get the whole picture at once. But that's not really how life works. You're only in life usually getting one little snippet, one moment at a time. And then thirdly, you don't know these people in the story. These are fictional people. In real life, it's usually involving people you know and have a connection to and a relationship with and a history with. So it's not as straightforward or simple in real life. But with those caveats, I really do think this is a helpful scenario to walk through and have conversation around. Okay, so let me go ahead and read through this story, and then we will. And I'm just gonna come out of share screen and read the story, and then we'll come back to the PowerPoint here in a moment. All right, so this is going to be a story read through the eyes of a mother in the story, and her name is Christina. All right, so here's the story. Christina writes, we had just moved to a new area, and in fairly short order, we found a new church that felt right. At a church event, a church elder named Will introduced himself and welcomed us. Will was very personable and nice and funny, and he and his wife, Jeannie, invited us to a small group at their house. He knelt down and gave our 4-year-old son, Josh, a fist bump and asked him how he liked his new preschool. He would often make a point to talk to our son, giving him high fives and fist bumps, asking him questions about how things were going. He often reminded our son, don't forget, Jesus loves Josh, this we know, for the Bible tells us so. We started attending the small group at their house and met some great families our age. At a picnic, a church picnic, at a park with a playground, Will told us and some friends that he would take a turn watching the kids, including his grandson he had brought, so we could get some time to talk. We were all right there anyway, so I didn't make anything of it at the time. In the next few weeks, Will continued to focus a lot of attention on our son. After small group, he would let our son pick out a small stuffed toy from his collection or borrow a book about tractors in a back room. I never felt comfortable with him being alone with Will, so I always went with them. One day, Will asked about setting up a play date for our son to come over and spend time with his grandson. He loves spending time with Josh. They seem to really get along. Something held me back and I politely declined. Will said, maybe some other time soon. Jeannie was thinking about maybe next week. I'll actually be out of town. And then he kept bringing it up a few more times, but I always came up with a reason to say no. Later that fall, my mom was in the hospital for a couple of weeks, and I spent a lot of time going back and forth to the hospital. One day during that time, Will dropped by with his grandson to deliver a meal Jeannie had made for us. He asked how we were holding up and told us how they prayed for us at the small group we had to miss. He also asked if we needed anything else. Then he said, I thought perhaps I could walk the boys down the street to the park and watch them for a bit, so you can get some rest or get some work done without him under your feet. Again, I declined. He persisted and said, are you sure? It's no trouble. One of the privileges of being part of a small group family is that we get to be the hands and feet of Jesus and to carry each other's burdens. Again, I said no, even though I admit I felt guilty. That night, I decided to talk to my husband. I told him that my gut was telling me that something was wrong here. Will is trying very hard to have time with our son, and something about this just doesn't seem right. We didn't have any evidence to report him or do anything drastic, but we agreed that it was concerning that I felt guilty and conflicted about saying no. We also weren't sure who we could talk to at the church about Will. He had been there forever and everyone loved him. We weren't sure how another leader would respond if we raised a concern. We were new to the church. Also, what could we say? Will is nice to our son and tried to set up a time for him to play with his grandson. What would they do? What could they do? We agreed that we at least would be very cautious anytime we were around Will at church or small group or anywhere. I said, I just believe that there is more going on here, even though I'm not sure what. A few weeks later, Will asked my husband if he could come over and help him install a new appliance. My husband loves helping with projects like this, so he said yes. Will also mentioned his grandson would be there and feel free to bring Josh and Jeannie would watch them. The morning he was supposed to go there without Josh, Jeannie called and said, don't come. She was very upset, but she didn't explain anything. A few days later, we learned that Will had been arrested for possessing and distributing child abuse images and videos, commonly called child pornography. He ended up serving some time in prison, and he also had to register as a known sex offender. Now that's the end of the scenario, but I just want to quote an actual mom who wrote about a similar experience she had and shared it publicly so people could learn from it. And she said this, what does a mother do with all of this? What can a parent take away from an encounter like ours? How can we use it for good instead of being eaten alive by anger or fear? All right, so there's a lot in that story. And let's just walk through a few basic questions together. And the first question is, how did Will appear to members of the community? So I'm going to share my screen again. So how did Will appear to members of the community? So if you want to audibly weigh in or put something in the chat, go for it.
Chat already says personable, kind, friendly, interested in what's happening in people's lives, upstanding, eager to help. He appeared kind and willing to help / serve others.
Yes. And he appeared like a grandfather and just a kind church person, a church leader, spiritual person, all of those things. Very good. Now, at the same time, with the whole context, which again, you often just don't have in real life, we can look at this whole story and all at once know, wow, he was very calculating. He was very persistent. And in fact, he was predatory. So here's a second important question. What did Will use to gain access to her son? What were some of the techniques he used? What stood out to you in that regard?
His own grandson.
Yeah, that was a key part of it, right? I mean, in many churches, even where we know everybody and everybody, you know, there's a high level of trust. Not many men go up to families with young kids and say, I want to spend time with your son and spend time with your kid directly. Very often that's not going to be something that is you know, accepted or is not viewed as some kind of weird or suspicious in some way. So clearly Will was using the grandson to sort of deflect and make sure that he wasn't trying to spend time with their son. He was just trying to facilitate the son spending time with his grandson. Yeah, good. What else?
The chat also says small group meetings, kindness, the fist bumps, gifts, grandson, even the opportunity to care for, you know, looking like they're caring when the elderly parent was in the hospital.
Right. Yeah. And again, what is Mike teaching you today? If someone asks to help you in some way, they're probably a predator. Is that what you're taking away from today's training? No, of course not. Mike is not teaching you that. Most of the time, someone who is trying to help you is simply trying to help you, and they're a genuine person. However, offenders, knowing this, use this as a tactic. And so just to be aware of it, and not presume everyone's a predator. Again, that's not true and that's not healthy. But to notice, and we'll come to the kind of the takeaways of what are the more subtle things we can look for very often that do make a difference. We'll get to in a moment. Okay, any other thoughts on that in terms of some of the things that Will was doing to try to gain access to this child?
Few people in this chat have also mentioned that he was developing this whole small group relationship. So there was the whole community trust.
Yeah, and that's a more intimate type of relationship in a church setting typically, and access in a home, which is a higher risk, more isolated areas. And certainly there's the spiritual component of that, right? He is a spiritual leader, and by cultivating that perception as he just is a good spiritual leader in the church and in the small group, that he would never do anything like hurt a child. So yeah, all of that is deliberate, typically a tactic that's being cultivated. So using the trust that we have in church, the trust that comes from leading prayer and leading Bible study and leading small group, all of those things, talking about spirituality, all of those things. And he was building trust. He was trying to be helpful, and then he changed tactics because it wasn't working. And so he also tried, well, you come to my house and help me. Help me install this appliance, and see, we all just care for one another. And so he was changing tactics. So again, if you see sort of a, well, again, do you see how that's related to this idea of testing? It's just about what works, what might further this, what might help him have more access, and certainly in a more isolated area or where the parents aren't directly caring and providing supervision, that sort of thing.
Somebody else asks that says the big issue seems to be the persistence.
Yeah, and that can be something. Now, many offenders are very clever, and they're not going to be this persistent and this obvious. But especially reading the whole story, we get a real sense of that, right? Okay. Now, here's the real takeaway. And this is really what recognizing grooming behavior gets to, and a lot of prevention work it hinges on. And here's the simple question. What defenses served Christina well in protecting her child in this situation? What are some of the things that you think you saw happening that really can make the difference, that we can take away from this and we can help everyone understand in our church communities? So what were the things that really served her well protecting her child in this situation?
The chat is blowing up with, she trusted her gut and so used caution,
Yeah,
mother's
and
intuition.
1 second, Katrina. I'm sorry. Let's do one at a time.
Gotcha.
So let's slow down for just a second, because these are so important. So let's start with that first one. That is such an important point. Her intuition, her gut. She thought, hey, this does not seem right. She did not have all the information. She didn't know for sure what was happening at first, and that's typical. But she knew just something doesn't feel right about this, and she listened to her gut. Now, all of us have intuition, and when we have a sense that something's not right, it is important that we listen to that gut feeling. Good. Okay, let's do another one.
No, actually, that's what I was saying, is that everybody was blowing it up with her gut. She trusted her gut, and she communicated well with her husband, who believed her.
And that's critical. Reaching out to someone who you trust, that you can process through. This is not, early on, there's nothing to report. We'll talk about reporting later. Again, this is the things that concern her are not leading to an obvious reporting situation. So what do? You talk to someone, you process, you say, I have concerns. What are they? What can we do about this? You talk and you make a plan. That's so critical. That's a really critical second area. And then a third area would be they took action. They took action before they fully knew what was going on. They said, well, given what we know and given our current concern, we're going to do this. We're going to be especially vigilant in regard to this and that, and here's how we're going to approach it. They talked through talking to church leaders, but because they just came to the church, they didn't do that yet. Now, what we would want ideally is that we have a church community where we're building a culture and we're vocal enough and have policies that everyone's aware of, such that there is a real proactive encouragement to bring any question or concern, certainly. So, but regardless of that, they made a plan and they took actions that were protective before they fully knew what was happening and whether their concerns were confirmed or validated. Good. What else?
Also in the chat, that she took note, she observed that he was always seeking out time with her son.
And he was pushing for more isolation away from her. And so she was especially vigilant with respect to isolation. He wanted to go give a book or a toy in a back room. And she just was like, well, I'll go with you. And it's easy. And, instead of having him be alone with her 4-year-old son just around the corner, she brought more transparency to the situation. She was very focused on vigilance with respect to isolation. And that's a really good boundary for any church to say, hey, at our church, unless it's your own child, you're not to be alone with a child, especially in an isolated area. In our church, we have just a boundary for our community, for everyone, that unless you're with your own child, that you're not alone with a child, and certainly not in an isolated area. That's a very simple thing. It helps raise the overall level of safety for everyone. And then lastly, notice that she had boundaries about her surrounding her son. And Will was trying to test those boundaries and even push past those boundaries. And she said no. I don't know how many times she said no to him, but she noticed that I set a boundary and he tried to push past my boundary. I said no, and he didn't respect that. The key is when we set a boundary, either as a community, as a family, or as an individual, and we name the boundary and we ask for someone to respect it. When someone does not respect it, they're sending about the clearest message they can that they're not a safe person. Now, are there occasions where someone doesn't grow up with good boundaries and we can teach them boundaries and then they get it and they're better at respecting the boundaries? Yes. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're a predator. But those who abuse power, again, as a tactic, are on a very calculated level seeking to push past the boundaries and test boundaries, to look for vulnerabilities and opportunities and gain information that they can use. So when you set a boundary, especially related to a situation of safety, a vulnerable person, anything along those lines, isolation, touch, and it's not respected, you're getting a very clear message that likely that is not a safe person. So trust yourself, trust your gut, get others who can help you. So again, do offenders use toys and gifts and touch and videos? Yes, but so do grandmas and so do grandpas who care about kids and love kids and would never hurt a kid. So again, the key is not necessarily the details of the behavior, it's how it's being used. All right. Any further thoughts So those are, to me, the key things we want to take away in turn, and that can be applied to other types of abuses of power. Listening to our gut, taking action, even if we don't have all of the details. We rarely do in this world. That's not how life works. Talking with someone we trust, making a plan, being vigilant with respect to boundaries and certainly isolation, and noticing when someone doesn't respect the boundary, whether it's a personal boundary we've set, a family boundary, or a church community boundary. Any other thoughts?
May I speak?
Please.
Yeah, I wonder, so the person that you described in the story is a strong person, a person who has very clear boundaries, like you said, and kept them, and even when pushed back, she kept them. A strong person, perceptive, not necessarily, forming a problem, because she really only had her gut feeling and what the little things that were happening, which alerted her. But I wonder that sometimes not everybody in our churches are that mature, are that perceptive, and even sometimes they don't even have the backbone, perhaps, to, well, he's maybe not really doing this. And also being part of a church, in a way, there's a sense of other people are vetting for this person, and maybe I'm wrong about it. I wonder whether, I don't know, this is a difficult thing without getting into not so much discernment, but rather suspicion. But the idea of having protectors, people who are kind of like on alert to things like that, it would have to be a mature situation in the church where you have stronger people helping, for a lack of a better word, weaker. That's not a good word, but that's what I mean. Could you comment on that, please?
Sure. No, it's a very perceptive point. And I think that's why, yes, we want to give these types of educational tools and skills, work on these skills, and empower everyone in the community. Because not every parent's going to see and can see what's happening, and maybe others can. And so it's not just about a personal family boundary, it's a boundary we set as a community. And maybe someone else in the community is perceptive and sees it, or is strong enough to say something or do something that makes a difference. So well said. Yes, absolutely. And our role as leaders is to facilitate this type of education and empowerment, knowing that, yes, many parents are not going to be able to do this on their own. And so we're all in process, and we can all grow in these areas. So yes, absolutely. All right, let's name one other major form of tactic that is so vital for you as leaders to be aware of. It's also important, I think, for congregations to have some education on this as well. It's a simple tactic. Dr. Jennifer Fried, who I mentioned at the beginning of the training, who developed in her research the language of institutional courage and institutional betrayal. She studied those who have abused power within organizations. And she noticed, and she asked a simple question: when someone raised a question of concern or accountability or an allegation against a person in power about abuse of power, how did the person in power who is alleged to have abused power respond? And she said there's a common set of responses from people who abuse power within organizations. And it's again, a variety of tactics. It's not any one tactic, but she expresses it with the acronym DARVO. And DARVO stands for deny, attack, reverse the victim, and the offender. So DARVO is how many offenders seek to deflect accountability. So denial: I never said that. I don't know where you're getting this. That's not what happened. You're ridiculous. Why would you believe that person? You're getting upset about nothing. It wasn't what you think, it's no big deal. Some form of denial, minimizing it, flat out denying it, excusing it, some form or fashion. Attack, put them on the defensive. You just like being in charge. You're trying to take control of this. I'm not going to allow you to gossip like this. If this is going to be a problem for you, then you need to think about whether you are going to stay on staff at this church. You know, a direct attack to put them on the defensive. And then reverse the victim and the offender. Will leaders always have people who target them for criticism and abuse? Well, do leaders face criticism at times, sometimes unfairly? Yes, of course. But what is often happening in these tactics, whether it's denial or attack or playing the victim, the goal of the offender is to disrupt the process of accountability or assessing accountability. They want to put you on the defensive and dismiss it and deflect any attempt to assess what might be appropriate in terms of accountability. And Dr. Fried says, look, I have bad news, but I also have good news. The bad news is when offenders who abuse power use DARVO, it is very effective. It is very effective at shutting down accountability and processes where accountability is assessed. That's the bad news. The good news is when we have some basic education about this tactic, and organizations have some basic education and examples of these tactics, DARVO loses a lot of its power. Now, notice I'm not saying if someone denies it, you know they're guilty or you assume they're guilty. That's not the point at all. You don't let the denial, though, interrupt a process of following through, of assessing accountability, if they're and what's appropriate. You don't let the offender claiming to be the victim stop a process where accountability is assessed. Does that make sense? And just having some examples, I've written a few here. You can revisit those. You can Google more. DARVO is becoming a more common term people use, like grooming, and it's a very important tactic for us to be aware of. In many cases, if you have an allegation or disclosure of abuse, you have tactics of DARVO, it actually adds more credibility if you know what you're listening to and know how to make sense of it. Now, again, that doesn't mean you presume again someone's guilty. You continue to follow through proper protocols and assessment. Now, I kind of badmouthed a little bit lists of concerns earlier. I do like to give them. And some of the common tactics that are used by abusive people. So for children and for adults, it is things we've already mentioned very often that are important to notice and be aware of. So isolation and touch and special gifts or focused attention, sexual language, jokes and stories, concerning things related to photographs and commenting on photographs and joking, you know, marry me, because a child is in a photograph, you know, and they comment on social media, secrecy, especially around gifts or alcohol or money being given, things like that. And then common offender distortions. Very often offenders use a pretense for abusing children, like, well, I was educating them about this, this thing. I was teaching them about hygiene. I was treating them medically, or I was helping them in the restroom, that sort of thing. So just knowing that those can be a common pretense for abuse and a cover, it means we don't jump to conclusions, but we don't immediately dismiss if someone has a ready explanation. Many offenders will have a ready explanation that's meant to deflect suspicion. So this information is here, and the same for clergy tactics against adults. Similar tactics are used. It's using spirituality and their authority and intimacy and care and weaponizing those things. Similarly, testing for vulnerabilities, trying to move things to a more isolated area, or taking advantage of circumstances where someone is more vulnerable, like they're grieving or they need counseling, they're having a hard time. So it's a similar approach with clergy abuse tactics. And it must be said to everyone in any formal position in a church, if you have any formal position and your church has set standards and boundaries in place and policies, you hold power and you have the ability to, as the person with greater power, the ability to uphold those boundaries. Many clergy over the years have said, well, this person initiated sexual contact. What am I to do? Well, you hold power and you can make sure that those appropriate boundaries are upheld and respected. And you have the power to ensure that that happens because of your position and the power you hold. We're going to have to skip a little bit ahead because of our time, and I want to make sure we get to issues of further response. But there is some more information here about policy and important policy boundaries and main policy elements that I would encourage all of you to look at. And especially, we've talked about this issue of making sure there's a clear mechanism to speak up regarding concerns or policy violations. But let's move ahead and close out our time with just some basics on reporting and response issues that we haven't covered already. I want every leader to have this framework. We want every adult in our church to have clarity on what they would do if it's a reporting situation, reporting of child abuse, or if there's some form of adult abuse. What do I do? My first step would be, if it's an adult, I would talk to someone in our church leadership if it relates to abuse with an adult in our church community. But beyond that, if there's a policy violation in our church or any other concern about safety, you want every adult to have the empowerment to know who they would talk to. Now, in certain churches, that's going to be a specific team or leadership, designated people in leadership. Very often, we're helping churches develop a safety team or a safeguarding team of men and women, such that everyone is very much encouraged. Hey, these designated people are here to receive any concerns and any information related to policy violations. They're also going to help facilitate our response if there is any abuse of power or allegation related to abuse of power. Very quickly on child abuse. Now, in New York State, not every adult is a mandated reporter, meaning you have a legal obligation to report child abuse. Professionals who work with kids very often are, and that's the case in New York, teachers and social workers and so forth. Clergy are mandated reporters, and in Virginia, where I am as well. But the reality is, as Christians, our legal obligation is just one type of obligation we have, and it's not, in my view, the most important. The most important obligation we have is that we have an ethical obligation or a moral obligation to speak up for kids who cannot speak for themselves. So churches must report child abuse outside the system, and in cases of emergency where we think the child could be actually in danger in this moment, you simply call 911 so that the safety of the child can be checked upon and any medical attention that's needed can be given. If that's not the case, of course, New York State has a child abuse hotline. Pennsylvania also has one as well. And then certainly, in our view, it's also worthwhile to go ahead and reach out to local law enforcement. Agencies are supposed to communicate well, but that doesn't always happen. So at the very least, though, calling this intake line that's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is important. And then after a report, and these are not just important steps for child abuse, I want to hear broaden and say, if church leaders gain any information related to potential abuse of power, whether against a child or an adult. So for a child, after it's been reported, you then would look at these main areas of priority. Let's assess safety. And again, to me, this must not be one individual. It must be a team effort. If we have a safety team or we have a leadership group, we have to share responsibility because this is hard. We have to account for different, different areas within our church community, and having people working together, helping each other. But number one, the highest priority is always safety. Are there safety issues right now? Is there anything we can do to raise the level of safety or address a safety issue that we see? Number two, and so just as an example, if you have, if this is the way it happens, you see the texts between the adult and the child, the teen who is a minor, and you see the sexualized texts, you report that. There is going to be, you're going to, as soon as possible, without interfering with any investigation, a drawing of a line of accountability for that person. If they have a role officially with youth, as soon as we're able to, without tipping them off, and with that, we would ask the investigator, hopefully they would help us assess that. We would draw a line of accountability because we've seen the text. We don't have to wait for a trial or anything, or whether they're even going to be charged. We've seen the concern already. And certainly in many cases of disclosure, we don't need hard evidence. We might go ahead and draw a line of accountability. And it's not fair for us to take on the role of investigator or judge or jury, but we are going to ask, given what we know, and given that the vast majority of disclosures are true, given the seriousness of the allegation, what lines of accountability can already be drawn until at least we know more or we have further information. And then third, we can initiate some form of care for survivors. So if someone discloses, if it's a child, we want to try to connect their family to, if there's a child advocacy center in the area, or if not, if there are any therapists or counselors that have expertise in trauma in our local area, we want to try to make those connections if at all possible. And then of course, we'll have a policy. We want a policy that outlines good steps for follow through to care well for survivors. And they're going to focus on those trauma-informed principles where we're prioritizing safety, agency, respecting their privacy, and so forth, and just seeking to take a posture of support in any way we can. And then we are going to likely need help from other support organizations or resources. So we might have questions, and we can reach out to a child advocacy center, or we can reach out to Grace, we can reach out to a trauma-informed therapist, we can reach out to the investigator and say, we have this information, and we also have a question. We didn't want to say anything until we had your okay to do that if you're investigating this individual. We didn't want to do anything that would get in the way of your investigation. So we might have questions regarding any number of issues. And so having a good practice, and even in your policy saying, we're going to reach out and get support for our questions as we seek to navigate a difficult situation. We do not inform the family if the alleged offender is in the family or in the household, or if that person is unknown when we report child abuse. We want law enforcement or social services, depending on what the case may be, to make that first contact if the offender is within the home or within the family. We do not want to make that first contact that a report has been made. It can get in the way of an investigation. As a church, we can fully cooperate with an investigation. We might have further information. Well, that individual is connected to these other families or these other children in the class or the small group or whatever the case may be. We do have to assess that there could be other victims in many cases. And again, our focus is on the vulnerable, not the institution or what this means for our church. And then if something is investigated and comes back as unfounded or unsubstantiated, those are typically technical terms that simply mean that the standard to charge someone was not reached. In a criminal court, the standard typically to charge someone is that you think you can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's a very high standard. So you may have someone investigated and not charged, and there is some evidence of wrongdoing. You might already have it as a church, but they may not be charged. And it's important for churches to know that when that comes back as unfounded or unsubstantiated, that often does not equate to exonerated or innocent. That's just not what it means. There may be further assessment that's needed, and very often churches would need to reach out to an organization or individuals with more experience to help them navigate that process. All right. Pam, if people have questions on child abuse reporting, I'm glad to do it. I do want to say a few words on adult abuse response in just a moment beyond what we've said. But if you want to share about denominational policies, you were going to share with the group a little bit at this point.
Yeah, just a few things. So first, before I forget, there's been a chat in the chat window. There's been questions of whether or not in New York clergy are mandated reporters. And right now, actually, they're not, but there is a bill on the floor.
Okay, I had that wrong. Forgive me. Yeah.
Having said that, I agree with Mike that so when people have asked me, are we mandated reporters? I've said legally no, morally yes. Okay, so that's in my mind, that's, you know, we don't protect people who are injuring children, right? We just don't. There is a policy coming that churches can use from Free Methodist USA that the denomination's working with Grace to update policy. I was hoping to have it by now, but it's not done yet. And they're actually doing it at our request. So just wanted to let you know that's coming your way. And at annual conference, we will have a workshop by Counselor Greg Harp on being freed up from shame and trauma. And so anybody's invited. That's on Friday of annual conference. One other thing that I think is just good for us to know is we are egalitarian in theology. And so in the Free Methodist denomination, we believe that God has given equal power to men and women. And so in some places, in some theological circles, you'll find, you know, people are talking like men have the God-given power, and that is not our theological stance. And I think that's just an important thing as we talk about all of this. If you discover abuse or you have abuse allegations, call the conference office like immediately, because this is a lot to process, right? There is the legal, there is their insurance, there is the pastoral care, there is the boundaries, and we've got resources across the conference. And so if you loop us in, and we can immediately start walking with you, so the burden does not fall on you. And I just, that's just want you to know that. Also, if you have a concern, one of those gut checks like the mom had, or, whatever, and in particular, if you have a concern that has to do with a pastor or a staff person, then I would also encourage you to reach out beyond your system, right? So reach out to me, a field superintendent, whoever, somebody in your conference community group, because sometimes it just helps to have somebody to bounce that off that is outside of your system. And we are happy to have those conversations. We're trying to create a healthy culture, not just at our local church, but at the conference as well. And so that's part of what we're hoping to see. And if you feel you weren't heard, try again with somebody else, right? That's just one of those places, because sometimes people think they hear or they don't take it seriously or whatever. So try again with somebody else. And then in the whole context of a posture of belief, we had somebody in the chat room say, but what happens if it isn't a real situation? if we're talking about, for example, a situation where we have an allegation of child abuse, we want to remove that person immediately. Okay, whether that's a pastor, whether that's a worker, and just to say, hey, we're going to remove you, and then we're going to take time to just see what's going on. And that, with pastors, we can offer somebody else coming in preaching, we can offer an immediate sabbatical, there's just a lot of ways we can do this, that if for some reason this really isn't right, it's okay. Like, we can still do it, but there's no reason that somebody should stay in the place they're in right away. In fact, if you go back to Darvo, sometimes when you tell somebody you're going to remove them for a period of time, you'll see all kinds of things come out that don't fit with this nice person that you thought they were. And that's just helpful in the process. So anyway, if in any of these things, if you're going, oh my goodness, how do we do this? Again, get involved with the conference office, because we can walk alongside you in those things. And if we need to step in and remove somebody, we can. So just wanted you to know all of that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And that's what it takes. It takes everyone working together. It takes denominational leaders, it takes local church leaders, it takes congregations as a whole being more tuned into these issues. Absolutely. And just a few more words on adult abuse response. So I mentioned earlier that advocates will say that you need to respect the agency of an adult who has experienced something like an assault or other types of abuse of power that would be a crime. It is important to respect their agency in making that report. I wholeheartedly agree with that. If someone, when I was a pastor, is in my church and they're experiencing assault, if they're experiencing intimate partner violence, anything that's a crime, ultimately, they have to choose personally whether they report that. My role as a pastor is that I'm going to try to support them in any way I can and give them agency. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not going to take other action. The other action I'm going to take is based on those trauma-informed principles. I'm going to prioritize safety. If I have word that someone assaulted someone in my church, we are going to assess safety. And we are going to work with that victim and everyone else on a safety plan for that individual and for the church. We are going to work, if it's intimate partner violence, I'm going to try to connect that person to those who have experiencing helping victims of intimate partner violence make a safety plan. And I'm going to try to connect them to other local resources, legal resources, financial resources, and otherwise that will help them if they are ready to seek a way out of that violence. And we are going to have a very high standard of accountability for anyone in our church that is accused of, or that we have reason to think that there's intimate partner violence. We're going to require a high level of accountability. We're going to focus on safety, and we're going to be very careful if there is any allegation of violence or abuse of power. And we're going to be very proactive in assessing safety and accountability issues. So of course I can't make an adult report the crime committed against them to the police, and I would never try to force someone to do that. But I'm still going to be incredibly proactive, and we are going to work together as a leadership group. We're going to reach out to others, our denominational leaders, like Pam said, to other advocacy groups who can help us. If you don't know where the intimate partner violence resources are in your community, reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Just Google it, you'll find it right away. Talk to someone there who can help you find some local resources. There's a National Sexual Assault Hotline. You can connect victims to support resources there that are confidential. They can talk to someone without reporting it to the police. They can talk to someone confidentially and get support and get connected to trauma-informed resources. Stalking is more common than most people realize. There are good stalking resources in our country. There's an organization called safehorizon.org. So if you go there, you can find, and that'll be in the slides, all of those numbers and the stalking resource website from Safe Horizon. And then, just like Pam said, the reality is you often have to ask someone to step aside for a time. And that's right. And you often have to reach for help outside of the organization. Everything we've said today about grooming means we as individuals and as a church are often in the worst position possible to objectively evaluate and assess the situation because of how grooming works. And again, that's not just with child offenders, that's with clergy offenders and other types of offenders as well. So we need to have those resources and reach out for help and work together. But the key always is to focus on those trauma-informed principles, safety, and empowering others, giving survivors agency, and working together to assess what the next right thing is to do. All right, we're at time, so I want to give everyone permission to go, but the last thing I need to say is just my brief sermon, again, on self-care. There is so much we've worked through today, and so much of this is very heavy. Please just devote some time in the next, hopefully hours and even few days, to some deliberate self-care. So I know Netflix is always pushing that murder documentary, and I get it. I want to know who did it too. I'm a sucker for it, but probably tonight's not the night for the murder documentary. Something light, something refreshing, something beautiful. Connect with loved ones, take a walk, get out in the sunshine. All of those things. God's beauty really is an antidote to the weightiness of these hard realities. So take some time to process through what you've heard. Take some time off from it also. And know that to come away with a lot of important things from a training like this, we're going to have to continue to process through and do a lot of self-care. So it's not on you. You're not alone. We're together in your church, in your setting. And thank you all for making time for an in-depth training like this. It's really wonderful to see your genuine care and concern and your priority in this area and all the amazing things you're already doing. God be with you all. And Pam, if it's okay, I'll close in prayer and then we'll dismiss everyone. And if you want to stay and ask questions, I'm glad to stay for a bit and answer questions.
And I'll stay as well. So if people want to talk to me.
Okay.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay. God, thank you for this time with my brothers and sisters. We need your help. Help us as we seek to wrestle through these hard issues, as we seek to protect the vulnerable, as we seek to hold others accountable for use of power and misuse of power. Jesus, be with us, give us your spirit, and help us, we pray. Amen. Thank you so much.
Mike, thank you very much. It was very helpful. Really appreciate it. So
absolutely.